Welcome back to another video. In this video I'm going to install and initialize Git on the Windows 11 operating system. Now if you are installing Git on a Linux or a Mac operating system, you can install it using these commands here. If you are installing it on a Mac, it's install via Homebrew and the command is brew install git. Otherwise, if it's Linux, it's install via your package manager and you can use the command sudo apt get install git. But we are going to be doing it using Windows. And with Windows, we can use Google search. So let's search for Git. And the website we want is git-sem.com. And we've got download for Windows over here. And the one I want is the standalone installer. And I'm going to be using 64-Git for Windows setup. So that's going to download now on the right hand side. And now that it's downloaded, we can click it to install Git. And we can click on yes. Do you want to allow this app to make changes to your device? Now the one thing we can do is if we open up the command prompt, we can check if Git's installed. So all we do is type Git, and if we press enter and it's not recognized, Git's not installed. Now going back to the setup, we can press next for the licensing information. And next it's where should Git be installed. Let's stick to the default, which is C program files Git. And this page shows us what components to install. So we can see there's a few components here, but we are going to stick to the defaults on here and click next. This time it's asking us where should setup place, the program shortcuts, and we will stick to the default. So we'll create a folder called Git and let's click on next. Now on this setup page, which editor would you like Git to use? And it always gives us some information here. So it's saying the Vim editor, while powerful, can be hard to use. But Vim is the default editor of Git for Windows, only for historical reasons, and it is highly recommended to switch to a modern GUI editor instead. Now if we drop this down, we can choose the editor of our choice, and in here we can see lots of popular editors. We can see Notepad++, Visual Studio, Sublime, Atom, and at the bottom we also see Notepad and WordPad, and I'm going to choose Notepad for this. So let's click on Notepad and click next. Now what would you like Git to name the initial branch after git init? Git init is the git initialize command, which initializes a repository. And if we let Git decide, Git uses its default branch name, currently master, for the initial branch in newly created repositories. But we can override it, and I like to override this. So I like to refer this to main as the main branch rather than the master branch. And by the way, a branch allows you to work on features and bugs without impacting your main branch. So you create your main branch. This is our default branch. The main branch is where our main production code is. But then, for example, when we are working on specific features and bug fixes, we create different branches. So we are not impacting our main branch. So that's what this is for. And in this case, it's just asking us what we want to name our main branch. It can be called the master branch, but I prefer the name main. So let's leave it as main and let's click next. Now adjusting your path environment. How would you like to use Git from the command line? So we can use Git from Git bash only, which is good for Linux and Unix users. And then the next option is Git from the command line and also from third-party software. And this is the recommended option. So this option adds only some minimal Git wrappers to your path to avoid cluttering your environment with optional Unix tools. And then it says you will be able to use Git from Git bash, the command prompt, and Windows PowerShell, as well as third-party software. And then the last option is use Git and optional Unix tools from the command prompt. So here it says both Git and optional Unix tools will be added to your path. So unless you need these two for specific reasons, stick to the recommended option here and click next. Now which secure shell client program would you like Git to use? So you can use the default, which is use bundle open SSH. This uses ssh.exe that comes with Git. And then there's a new option, use external open SSH, and this uses an external sh.exe. And with this, Git will not install its open SSH binaries, but use them as found on the path. And you can read what it says here, but let's stick to the default, use bundled open SSH, and let's click next. Now which SLTLS library would you like Git to use for HTTPS connections? So the default is use the OpenSL library. Server certificates will be validated using the cabundle.crt file. And then we also have the option use the native Windows secure channel library. So in here, server certificates will be validated using the Windows certificate store. For when you have a company's internal root certificate, that you want to use. And this option is good because it allows you to use your company's internal root certificates. For example, using Active Directory domain services. But we are going to use the top option, use the OpenSH library. Let's click next. Now for sure, this is the option to use for Windows. This is the recommended setting on Windows, but this is the recommended setting on Unix. And then there's the as is. So Git will not perform any conversion when checking out or committing text files. So by the way, it does say how should Git treat line endings in text files. And we will stick to the recommended one for Windows here. Let's click next. Terminal emulator do you want to use with your Git bash? And then again, we will stick to the default. Use min-tty, the default terminal for MSWise2. And as usual, it tells you more about it over here. Or we can use the Windows default console window, but just to bear in mind, it says it has very limited default scrollbacks. Needs to be configured to use a Unicode font in order to display non-ASCII characters correctly. So it's got some limitations. So let's stick to the top one and click next. Now this is about the default behavior of git pull. What should git pull do by default? We will stick to the default, which is fast forward or merge. So fast forward the current branch to the fetched branch when possible. Otherwise, create a merge commit. You can also choose rebase and rebase the current branch onto the fetched branch if there are no local commits to rebase. And rebase is the equivalent to a fast forward. So the first option. And then the last option is only ever fast forward. So this will fail if fast forward is not possible. Again, let's stick to the default, fast forward or merge. And now this setup page is about which credential helper should be configured. And this stores all of the credentials, including the credentials to connect to GitHub and other websites and other applications as well. So this uses Git Credential Manager and this does not. So let's stick to the default again. I'll click next. So here are some features we can use. Enable file system caching, and this is a good thing because it provides a significant performance boost. And then this is to do with symbolic links, enabling symbolic links. So you can do this if you wanted to, but we will leave it as disabled. Let's click next. Now it says here, these features are developed actively. Would you like to try them? So the first one is enable experimental support for pseudo consoles. And it tells you here this allows running native consoles, programs like Node or Python in a Git bash window without using Wimpy, but it's unfortunately not quite stable yet. And then this is enable experimental built-in file system monitor. So it can speed up common operations such as git status, git add and git commit that are inside work trees that contain many files. So this is a feature to speed things up. So that was quite a few options, but we have got there and we can click on install to install Git. So now Git has now installed, we can click on finish. Actually, we can click on launch Git bash as well and view the release notes. And let's click on finish. So it will open up Git bash. Let's open up the release notes. And in the release notes, we can see, we can have a look at the known issues. We can have a look at new features, including bug fixes. So that's in the release notes if you wanted to have a look at those. We are going to skip this and jump on to Git bash. Actually, before we use Git bash, let's go back to the command prompt and type git. Right, it's still not recognized it because we need to start the command prompt again and click on git. And now it's recognized git, and over here it says these are the common git commands used in various situations. So we can see some of the commands we can use. Start a working area, work on the current change or examine the history and state. Now actually, before we jump onto Git bash, if we have a look at the start menu, we see three options. So Git bash emulates a bash environment on Windows. It lets you use all of the Git features in the command line and also many of the standard Unix commands. So if you are a Unix user, you would use Git bash. Otherwise, for Windows, it's Git command line, which is the Git CMD. And this is basically using the Windows command prompt with the Git commands. So you can use all of the Git features through the command line. And again, it's useful if you work on Windows commands and you work on Windows. Now, finally, there's the Git GUI, and this has minimal features, but let's have a look at it. It's got create new repository. It's got clone existing repository. It's got open existing repository. If we have a look in here, it's got the same thing, new, clone, and open. So the Git GUI is there to create, clone or open repositories without having to do anything with commands. So it's got minimal features, and that's why we are going to use Git bash. Now, when you install Git, the first thing you need to do is set up a username and email address. And these are needed, both of these are associated with each commit. So every time we commit Git, these two pieces of information are associated with each commit. So the way we do that is git config -- global user.name, and then we specify our name inside speech marks and press enter. Now for user.email we could do the same thing, but it's user.email instead of user.name. And I'm going to use a fake email here, so this is not real, and let's press enter. Now if we use git config -- list, we can see all of the current configuration settings. So if you want to see what your current settings are, you run the git config -- list. So in here we can see things like user information, repository settings, color preferences. And right at the bottom here we can see my username and my email address we have just set up. The next thing we want to do is initialize a repository. So we can either clone an existing repository if we are working on an existing project, or we can create a brand new one. And we are going to create a brand new one. But the first thing I will do is create a directory. So if I do a pwd, just to understand where I am in terms of my working directory. Now let's use the mkdir command to create a new directory, and let's call it my git. So let's change directory to my git, and we could specify the full path and then my git, enter. And finally let's do a pwd to make sure we are in my git, which we are. So it shows my git over here. Now we can initialize git inside the new folder, my git, and we do this using the git init command, which initializes a new git repository in the current directory. So it's done that instantly, and it's telling us initialized empty git repository, and it tells us where it's initialized the empty git repository. And if we see here, it's created a hidden directory called .git, named .git inside the current directory. And this git directory contains all of the necessary files and subdirectories that Git needs to store repository metadata and object databases. Maybe if we do a pwd here, sorry, not a pwd, a dir, and we see nothing actually because it's a hidden file. What we can do is open up the folder. Now if I go to this PC, C drive, users, jaff, and then my git, it should be in here, but it's a hidden file. So if we go to view, options, and then view, show hidden files and folders, apply, OK. There we are, so we do see it now. And here's all the hidden information in here. Now the next thing we can do, if we go back to git bash and we do a git status, this is a command we will use often. It's a very common command used with Git because you need to know the status of Git, the status of your repository. And what we can see here is on branch main. So we did call the default branch main, and we can see it says no commits yet. There's nothing to commit. Create copy files and use git add to track. So it's basically saying add some files in here first. So this provides a summary of the current state of the working directory and the staging area. It displays which changes have been staged, which haven't, and which files are not being tracked by Git. So using the git status helps developers understand what changes have been made to the working directory and what steps are needed to prepare these changes for a commit. And that brings us to the end of this video. So that's how we install Git on Windows 11 and how we initialize a new repository, and just have a look at the current state of the repository using the git status command.